Greetings to you all, and welcome to my talk. I'm delighted to join the Vikings Geography Week and to open up by talking about maps, which I adore. Now, I'm John Lippiett. I live in Chichester, which is quite close to Portsmouth, a great naval base on the south coast of England. And I've been a guest speaker with Viking for some 5+ years. And I have traveled quite extensively, many thousands of nautical miles. And I've started in the Baltic, up to the North Cape in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean from east to west, and did a third of a round the world cruise, which was absolutely fantastic out in the Pacific. Before that, I've had a couple of careers. I've had 36 years in the Royal Navy. I had worldwide operations, several commands, I'm pleased to say. And then when I retired, I had 13 years at the Mary Rose Trust, looking after King Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, 500 or so years old, and one of the greatest UK treasures there is, not only the ship, but also the thousands of artifacts from it. So that perhaps explains something of my love of both the sea, but also history. And I've always been fascinated in the relationship of the early voyages of discovery and the maps that developed as the Europeans went farther and farther afield, bumping into unknown lands. And you can almost read the minds of those ancient mariners looking at those maps and to understand something of their objectives. And the 15th and 16th centuries were critical to those early years of exploration, going farther away than ever from Europe. And the Mary Rose is the only existing example of the sort of ships that they took in those days. So over the next hour, I'm going to look at some of the key mariners who led the way and the maps that their knowledge then were put by the brilliant cartographers to be displayed. And we will seek to understand what drove the mariners to sail into the unknown across the horizon. So sailors discover the unknown world 500 years or so ago. And I'm going to show you a lot of maps, but I'll be pointing out each time I go the things I'm looking for. But let's first of all think about those ancient mariners, because when they came back from sea, they told mighty stories about the monsters and the horrors that they met at sea, not surprisingly. So I always say when I'm out there as a speaker, never believe a sailor. They make up all sorts of things, and perhaps I may even today, who knows. But here's an old print of some of the monsters, but so often they put them into their maps as well. So here's a map of 1570 by Ortelius, a Flemish man, a brilliant cartographer, one of the first atlases, but there off the coast of Africa is a carrack. I'll talk more about those being attacked by a great sea monster. But if we look at an earlier map, that of Scandinavia by Magnus from Norway, the extraordinary things that he shows on his charts, well worth looking at. But there you can see a serpent eating men on board one of the ships. So beware when you go to sea what's going to come about. Of course, in Viking, it is so calm, serene, and wonderful. And we know exactly where we are to a meter or two. Except when I looked at the chart when we were going up the fjords, I saw this and I looked as though we'd gone aground. So I popped up to the bridge and thankfully, of course, we were going through one of the narrow straits up there. So that's what the passengers see. But on the bridge, of course, are all sorts of instruments that show exactly where you are, what your exact position is to a meter or two, what the depth is, what the log speed is, your speed over the grounds, what the wind is, and so on, full of information. So we're never in danger in those days. And some of the excitement's gone out of it, because I navigated around the world, I have to say, using a sextant and taking stars and sun sights. But that's another matter, because now I want to go back into the earliest of days with the ancient Greeks and look at their concept of the world, because 6th century BC, this is the sort of thing they described, that the Earth was just a disk, and there were 3 continents, Europe, They knew about Asia, which they traded with, and also Libya, which bounded the Indian Ocean. So Libya, in fact, is Africa, what they called Africa. So if we take this disk that they knew, there it is in modern technology, except, of course, they didn't know that the American continent was there. So that is the sort of landmass, not in so much detail, that the various explorers, principally from overland, but also by coastal navigation and trading, they saw. And of course, we always put north at the top of a page, don't we? But they did not. And very often, the early maps actually start with east at the top of the map. And it orients is the rising of the sun. Because the sun rises in the east, they put the east as the most important point. So early maps show that. And this is called a T and O map. Do you see a T inside the O surrounding it? And this is very common right through Europe as a way of describing the world. So you've got the Mediterranean there. Of course, you'll recognize this. This map was actually made for the Bishop of Cadiz, which is why it says Cadiz at the bottom of it. But you've got Asia, and that's then the Danube and Black Sea there, and the Red Sea. So I think most people could pass their test in geography if they were asked that. Now, this is a more developed map. It's probably the oldest map of the Europe that we have in this country, about 1,000 years old, based on a Roman map, we believe, because of those straight lines across it, which actually indicate the Roman Empire. But of course, this is similarly orientated to the north, with Asia at the top, Europe and Africa. So let me reorientate it now. And I'm arrowing there the Mediterranean, not particularly recognizable, but there's the British Isles, and Scotland's been a bit wiped out. They actually erased some of it to put the islands further to the north. The Red Sea, and very often in old maps, the Red Sea is actually colored red, which is quite helpful. And many of you will know, I think, the Hereford Mappa Mundi. It's, I think, about 5 feet tall. It's 3 foot or more across in Hereford, done by the religious monks there, putting it together. It's a TNO map, exactly the same. And let's look at the top. There is God in the heavens, in the east. All sorts of religious connotations there, the pearly gates, and then people being sent to hell with God sitting in charge. But the whole thing is an encyclopedia. There I've arrowed an elephant, but they were putting everything they thought they knew about the world, putting detail in. And I could give a talk for an hour just about this map. But let's have a look at it. I've reorientated it now to put north, in our view, at the top. So you've got Jerusalem in the center, you've got the Red Sea there, the entrance to the Mediterranean there, Africa there, and you'll see the Nile coming out of the Mediterranean. And then up top, on the edge of the world, are the British Isles. Close-up of that shows Scotland is the blue streaks are the great rivers of the country, but Scotland showing separate. You've got England and Wales and then Ireland showing there. And that was done for Hereford. I'm now going to go way back to about AD 150, when a Roman, Claudius Ptolemy, living in Alexandria, and working where the great library had been and working on all the books that were still available from it, talking about the things that had been learned before. He was working away at geography. He's a brilliant geographer, astrologer, mathematician, and following all sorts of things. He is one of the most seminally important people of the whole story. Now, the Greeks knew that the world was round. They knew that if you went across the horizon, under the horizon, then it went out of sight. So they were clever enough for that. And the various calculations are shown here from Plato all those years ago. Archimedes, Eratosthenes was the most accurate before, but then in blue, the true circumference, Posidonius, and then Ptolemy. And I will come back to Ptolemy, but Ptolemy underestimated the size of the world, tremendously important when the voyages came. But he wrote a great tome called Geographia, his treatise of mathematical construction of the world map. and it showed 8,000 town coordinates, and he had created a graticule on which he could work out what we will call today latitude and longitudes. And he had got those from previous scholars in the Library of Alexandria who had collated them from the merchantman, but he went on doing so, building up the collection. And from that, he published a book about it, this Geographia. Here am I holding in the Admiralty Library, 1533 copy of it in Greek. And in it, it shows the graticule that he had. And that is horizontally is the equator. And then he's divided up his divisions in that manner. And then he has done another diagram in it there to actually show with the equator in the center there, the two tropics, and how he's going to put his world in a span of 180 degrees. And this was his known world. Now, we don't think he ever made a map. There's no sign of it, but his book left Alexandria and went to Constantinople. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, 1453 it is, some of the books were taken out of it, and the book came out. And later on, in the 14th century, they started plotting, in the 15th century, plotting what he did. And this is one of the earliest maps drawn from it. And let me explain it a bit, because you may see Europe at the top, but the Insula Fortunata, probably the Canary Islands or the Madeira, Cape Verde, possibly, but on the edge of the world, the very edge of the known world. But you can see, I think, the Mediterranean is looking pretty good there and to be understood. Now, from those early manuscript ones, it's perhaps easier to look at this one, which is printed in Germany. His work became widely known right through Europe, and people really admired and honored these ancient Greeks, who were the philosophers, the people they respected. So Ptolemy's word was almost law, and this will come out time and time again in the talk. And therefore, these were used even as mariners were finding new places. Let me point out that this is the Indian Ocean, but it shows it as a closed sea, that what we would call Sri Lanka today is Ceylon, but it's India, which has been misshown as an island. And then up in Europe, Scotland is always shown leaning over towards Europe, quite apt, perhaps, today. And that's through probably a miscribing of the coordinates, which was always repeated thereafter. So those are the telltale signs of the Ptolemaic projection. Now, navigators found that sort of thing no use at all. So they had charts which they made called portolans, portolani. And this is the oldest to exist at the end of the 13th century on a hide. And it's the names of the ports, but puts the names of the countries that they're representing. Hard to understand, but that gives you a clue. This is the earliest in the Library of Congress, 1335. Again, hard to understand, so let me put the names in. But the ports are written in there, the mariners having worked it out. I'm going to use this map. These are my photographs from the Atlas in the Admiralty Library, but I put a reference there for who wants to look, because in the Library of Congress, they've got on their website the Atlas of Adnesi. They produced quite a few, and these were manuscript maps of exquisite detail and the like. So I'm going to just show you how a portolan worked, because it's important for navigation. And many of you will know the Mediterranean, Sicily, the toe, the boot of Italy, and may know the Bay of Naples. The cobwebs across it are called rum lines, and as sort of compass rose. They were able to use a compass, but they weren't calling them bearings at that time, but divided into 32 sections. And in effect, these are compass roses, north, south, east, and west. And mariners could use these to set a course and steer on their magnetic compasses, which had come into the Mediterranean, I think, in the 13th century, and they could steer and navigate using these maps. So if you go into the Bay of Naples, which I'm sure you know, it will explain this sort of thing. The headlands, and they always put headlands because the sailors would sail from one headland to the next on a certain bearing. They'd know how long it took, they'd know what sort of bearing it was, so that's how to get the shape quite accurately of the coast. And so lots of these headlands, and these are the points from which they would aim all the time. Then the islands of it, and there I bring Ischia and Capri, which some of you will know. So those really stand out, and they can navigate well from these. And then they put rocks, because sailors are always worried about rocks, dangers to navigation. So these are very good, capable maps made 500 years ago. And then they have the cities and towns noted there. In red, they put the important ones. So I've just shown there Naples and Salerno. And then in black, and I put Amalfi. Many will know the Sorrento Peninsula and Amalfi and the like. So full of knowledge and really useful for sailors. But again, I will go back because the ancient trade routes, which had been way before any portolans and so on, people traveling without maps, but they were the trade routes, the Silk Road inland, bringing all sorts of goods, but particularly the spices and so on out of Asia, but the maritime spice routes across the Indian Ocean from the South China Seas, up the Red Sea, and then going to Alexandria and Constantinople, most wonderful spices and oh so important and expensive. They were used, obviously, for culinary purposes, flavoring bland food, disguising putrid food, as those so often to do. And I see that person in the foreground actually carrying a model boat to show where they would have come from. But for medicinal purposes, all these things, indigestions, flatulence, stomach pain, headaches, dysentery, impotence, disinfectant, hiding bad odors, indeed. So they were valuable. The rich people paid a lot of money for them. Marco Polo is one of those famous people, and many of you will know a lot. He traveled for 24 years with his father and uncle as a young man, but returning laden with riches and gems. And the year later, while fighting for the Venetian fleet, he was captured by Genoese and put into prison, where he dictated his tales, published as The Travels of Marco Polo, known as Il Milione as a nickname because they thought it was so outrageous what he was saying. The roofs out in Cathay, China, in effect, he went to the court of Kublai Khan, were tiled in gold and so on. The pavements were of gold, but they were amazed. And he comes into the story because people want to go and find what he had found. The other reason people wanted to go and travel out of Europe is that Islamic faith had spread, and the Moors were the Ottoman Empire moving across against Europe. And it was said that there was a high priest, Prester John, a Christian, out in the east. This map, a Portuguese one, shows him ruling Ethiopia, and indeed, a Christian nation. But there are many reasons. This is not just a myth, that there were many Christians farther to the east, and indeed in early days the Pope sent envoys out into Asia to try and meet up with them. But they wanted to find Christianity and then attack the Islamic traders and the like from the other side. My story takes us to Portugal because they're the first of the great seafaring exploring nations. And King John I of Portugal married Philippa of Lancaster from England, and of their 3 children, the youngest Henry, Prince Henry, born 1394, and he was not going to inherit the throne. He turned his attention to the discoveries and led the way. So Portugal, really hemmed in by Spain, was looking to the sea. They were, and are today, very good mariners. They get to Madeira, they get to the Azores, they colonize Madeira and start exporting timber, sugar, and wine from there back. So they get the taste of this, but they want to go farther, and Prince Henry is pushing them. Prince Henry, the Don, says there's no peril so great that the hope of reward will not be greater, because a chap called Eames gets down to Cape Bojador, and I've arrowed it there, and I've shown a photograph of it, where the sea seemed to boil, and it was hot, And they said, we cannot go farther. And Henry sent him back again, do it again, strain every nerve to pass that cape. And indeed he did pass it the next year. And so the explorations went on further and farther down to the Tropic of Cancer. These are very effective. And they found there that actually, rather than sailing back along the coastline against the current that was casting them down, it was best then to sail out into the wider ocean, losing touch with land altogether, which is very frightening for a mariner, but then sail in stronger winds away from the current, pick up the southwesterlies, and return that way. I must say here that they had full blessing of the Pope. He conceded to the king that the entire faculty of attacking, conquering, and subjugating all Saracens, by which he meant Africans, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, and to reduce their persons to continual servitude. Slavery had been in place since the earliest of civilizations, Egypt and Greece, Roman Empire, and the Vatican itself had its own slave market. So this was nothing unusual. And this was one of the driving factors also for the Portuguese. Now, in Henry's lifetime, they got into the Gulf of Guinea, as shown there. So he achieved a great thing. And then there was a slight lull in things before the Portuguese got going again. But the sort of ship they had was a development of the Viking longboat with a great single one sail, square sail. And they made the ships much more tubby to carry more trade in it and more people and more stores and the like. And they were not very maneuverable, and they could not sail very close to the wind. If they were against the wind, they were really stuck. But the Portuguese had fishing boats that went out into the Atlantic with lateen sails, very effective, sailing much closer to the sea. And these they had developed to go exploring later on. And here are diagrams of them on the left with these lateen sails, lateen coming from Latin and coming from the Mediterranean, but then having a mixture in the same hull and the same spars, but according to the winds, they could change the rigging and the sail plan in order to either sail close to the wind or downwind. A very, very good maneuverable, and that sped them up. So the maps that came out of this, and this Portuguese map of what goes on around the west coast of north part of Africa, very detailed. I ring their Mina because the mine with gold mines. And they put a fortified factory, a factory as their sort of base on the Gold Coast, as they called it there. So they're putting their mark, and they are starting to put amongst the local people, their fortresses, the start of an empire. And they would put down their marks, either in this way, in scratching the rock, a cross to put the Christianity into it, and the Portuguese coat of arms. And Diaz gets down eventually to the Cape of Good Hope. And there he put up in Port Elizabeth, as it is now, a pillar with the Portuguese coat of arms on it. This is a replica shown there. That is grand because it shows that he can get into the Indian Ocean, contradicting Ptolemy, that it was closed. So here is the map by Martellus, which has actually grown out of that, and it shows Ptolemy has lost that the Indian Ocean was closed. And that map you will see repeated time and time again. You may see the island of India, as it were, is wrong there. I want now to turn the same sort of time to a globe, the Beheim from Bohemia, Michael Bohemia Beheim globe in Nuremberg, called the Earth Apple, the Erdapfel. And it is very telling and important because I'm showing there the Mediterranean on it, very recognizable. There it's Ptolemaic India separated, but it shows that the south of Africa is open into the Indian Ocean. But it also shows, I put the Canary Islands there, and it shows Japan, Marco Polo. So Japan was some 1,000 miles off the coast of China, of Cathay. And there's China, Cathay there. So that was where it's placed by the geographers. And if we look at a tracing of that very globe, and show it there, it shows that if you go down to the Canaries and cross on the same latitude, that's the distance from the equator, then you'll bump into Japan, Jiangsu, as it's shown there, before going on to China itself. The point is, they were using in those maps and in the globe Ptolemy's circumference of the world disastrously, because it was too small. And therefore, the mariners were making the wrong calculation from what the cartographers were telling them. And if we were to put the sort of projection that I showed you on that globe and in the map, and then can you see underneath in lighter blue, the American continent is shown there, you can see where things went so very badly wrong as people set across trying to get to Japan and to Cathay. And the person who tried it first was Christopher Columbus. And here we are. Now, he was born in Genoa, but he went to Spain, then he went to Portugal. He married the daughter of the governor of a small island just off Madeira. And he was an important person because he actually had a library and he was very interested in old books and maps and the like. And he actually was giving the ability for Columbus to study there. Columbus went to King John II, who was the successor of John I, and he said, I want to sail west and I can get to very easily to Japan. And King John said this, Columbus is a big talker and boastful and setting forth his accomplishments and full of fancy and imagination. So King John dismissed him. And so he turned to Spain, Castile and Aragon, Ferdinand and Isabella. And they decided that they would indeed sponsor him and give him some ships. So he did. Now, the books that he was particularly paying attention to was, and this is the actual copy on the left there, The Travels of Marco Polo. And these are Columbus's notations in the margin. So he is actually paying a lot of attention and reading and studying Ptolemy's Geographia to look at the distances being talked about, which is why he said he could leave that side and pop out that side very easily. And it was not to be. Now, the ships had developed by this stage. The caravel was too small for long journeys, and they created a stouter ship, a carrack. And let's look at those because they could be between 60 and 100 feet. And the Mary Rose is one of these ships, built a bit later on, but with square sails and lateen sails, so maneuverable and better than the earlier ships for seagoing. And if we looked at Columbus's Santa Maria, which was his flagship, 70 foot long, that's, I've shown there, the ship's tenders of Vikings are 47 feet. So tiny boats. When we're out in those and disembarking by boat, just think of crossing the Atlantic and think something not twice the length. And he went with 2 caravels as well in his fleet, tiny ones, smaller than the Viking tender. My goodness me. And off they set, 1492. They sailed down to the Canaries where they replenished their food and so on, then set off. 28 degrees north is their calculation to get to Japan. He thought that would be easy, sailing along the latitude, looking at the height of the sun each day at midday to check he was at the right latitude, which he could. He was going farther and farther, meeting storms. His sailors were getting very, very unhappy. And he was worried. He wrote 2 logs, one of which was true and he kept secretly, and the other one he let the sailors see if they could read, which actually showed that they hadn't quite gone so far because they wanted to know they could turn around and get back if they need to, which they couldn't have done. There's signs of mutiny, and would they take over command from him? But in fact, they saw migrating birds flying over the top of them. They decided to follow the track the bird showed them. I think they were cuckoos. And they turned to the southwest. And that meant that they could actually bump into land, which they did on the 11th of October to a little island. It wasn't what he said it would be, just a mere 4 weeks. It was 10 weeks. They survived it remarkably well, actually. And then they started exploring the area. They met the local people. They exchanged some goods. They claimed it. You see a cross being put up there, bringing Christianity to the heathens, as they've been told to do. The flagship, the big ship, sank. And so they used the timbers to make a fort, and he left quite a lot of his men there to guard his possessions. and they went back in the tiny boats, crossed the Atlantic, stormbound, but got back with the news. And he's lucky enough to sail farther up and hit the trade winds, which drove him back in good stead. He went on to do a further 3 voyages after that, claiming that he had found the Indies, the East Indies, but of course what we now call the East Indies is what he found. But he did get down onto the north coast of South America, and he did get down to Central America, to the Isthmus, to give a clue of what this was. But that is why Spain predominated in that area. Now, Portugal was going down Africa. Spain had gone across into what we now call the Caribbean. They turned to the Pope saying, well, who owns what? And the Pope had a papal bull, and he said, right, Portugal, and the dotted purple line there is the Pope's decision. Portugal, you can go east, and Spain, you can go west, and anything you find, if they're not Christian, you can have it. So that was the decision. And then there was a Treaty of Tordesillas shortly afterwards, which shows why Brazil speaks Portuguese, for a start. And later on, they decided how they would split the East. And we're talking about the Treaty of Saragossa later. Now, not everyone agreed with that, certainly not Henry VII of England. And he commissioned John Cabot, who was a Venetian, Giovanni Cabotto, and who had come to England. And he had the ship, the Matthew, a carrack, a small carrack, and this is a replica of it, which is in Bristol at the moment, who sailed across the Atlantic. I have to say, just as the Vikings had done in about 1000 AD or so, and had proved that they could, but farther north from Iceland, he sailed across the Atlantic from Bristol and found a land which was teeming, the sea around it teeming with fish, which he called Newfoundland. And he got back. He went for a second trip and never reappeared again. They don't know what happened to him. But that is John Cabot, who showed that no one agreed with the treaty that the Pope and Spain and Portugal had done. But the Portuguese pushed on. Vasco da Gama, an amazing navigator, pushed off from Africa much farther out in the Atlantic Ocean, sailed down it, and swept across in a storm, going around the Cape of Good Hope, up the east coast of Africa, where he hijacked pilots to take him across to the Indies, as he thought. He got to India, in fact, to Calicut, as we know, and there he tried to trade with the locals. He took some spices on board from there, and then they got nasty, so he tacked when the weather was all wrong and had a disastrous voyage coming back against the winds, but he did get back successfully. And this voyage into the Indian Ocean to get to India is just as important as Columbus's far more famous one, going across the Atlantic. The Portuguese followed up straight away by Cabral, who was given a much bigger fleet, many more men to go off. And there I've shown his, in red there, his track, and he heads right out into the South Atlantic. And in doing so, he actually bumps into the eastern coast, much farther down of what is Brazil. And then he sets off and he gets around, a very successful voyage in one way, but he lost a lot of ships. 13 ships, 1,500 men, that's massive. Some foundering in the Cape of Good Hope storm with 380. 5 ships fully loaded. So it really paid its worth from all the spices they came back with, but with great losses as well, which was quite typical. Fleets sailed later on to be never heard of again, entire fleets. So that comes out of this is a very important one as well. Waltzing Muller, a cartographer from Germany, makes this 1507 after that voyage. And here it is, wood blocks. There's, I'm pointing South America, the American continent, as we now know it. I'm going to go to a black and white one. These are woodcuts, and you can see, in fact, 12 panels there. Each panel is about 2 foot by 18 inches. Very fine printing, and we'll just go down into this area to have a look, because this is the first map to use the name America for the continent, because Amerigo Vespucci had navigated on that voyage, but he'd also been on other voyages, and he wrote a book about his voyages. So his name took the credit for finding these coasts, and that's why Wardsi-Muller called this America. But it was with the Portuguese, and there's a Portuguese flag over that ship just off the coast there. But let me just point out, this map is using a Ptolemaic projection, which has been extended beyond the limits that Ptolemy stopped it at, but it still has India, the wrong shape, and Scotland leaning over. But importantly, it's starting to show the east coast of the North American continent, and it's showing China separated from America, which is a debate that went on for some time. Another person from Florence, sorry, I misspelled that, is Rosselli. And his world map is the first to show the North and South poles, as we could call them today, but the graticule ending at a single point. And it's worth it for that. But also, it shows that the North American continent, unlike Wardsi-Muller's, is connected to Asia, importantly so. It shows that South America, as we call it now, stretches in under Japan there, right through the Pacific. And there we are, there's the Ptolemaic giveaway, that is Ptolemaic, but the land mass in the bottom, because you had seen Ptolemy showed a massive landmass right to the bottom, the Indian Ocean enclosed. But the Greeks believed that to keep the world from toppling over, there must be vast continents or continent in the south to balance the world, otherwise it would have just toppled over. So charts so often show an unknown land to the south. Now the Portuguese pushed on, they inhabited and started governing India itself, and the maps developed from that. A brilliant Portuguese map, 1502, really early. And you see it beautifully colored in, the Red Sea there, and then up into the Arabian Gulf, colored blue, India there. If we close in on India, which I've arrowed there, but they captured Cochin and occupied it for the start. And then they got down to Malacca and captured that thereafter. And that gave their way to the Spice Islands. And I've had to go to a later map now for that, because they found the Spice Islands and they got there, they loaded up the ships. And the first ship they loaded up to the gunwales with spices, then sank on its way back. But they had found where the spices were. This makes Portugal an incredibly rich nation. They go on trading up to China. They find the Pearl River, and the Chinese start trading shortly afterwards. There we are, Ortelius again looking at it, but they're starting to understand the layout of that area and the Spice Islands as in these maps. Now, Magellan was a Portuguese, and he wanted to go west with Spain because he thought he could probably find a way through this continent called America to get into the Pacific, which would be easier than the Portuguese longer route around. So he was given 5 ships, 250 men, and a fleet to go up. Let's look at his ship in relation to a Viking, still small. And on a modern map, he gets down to Rio de Janeiro. He goes up the River Plate. He thinks it's perhaps a channel through into the Pacific. He sails up it for 4 days before finding it's a closed bay. And of course, it's a river. And had he tasted the water, he would have found it wasn't salty. He then gets down, I beg your pardon, he gets down to over winters in Port St. Julian, and then explores down the coast, losing one of the ships on the way, doing a reconnaissance in a storm. He finds a strait. A couple of ships go in and then come out again saying there's a way through. He goes through what is now called the Magellan Straits into the sea. And when he gets there, he's calling it the peaceful sea, Mare Pacificum. Very rarely is it so, but in this case it was calm, and that's how he called it. And then he made his way across, thinking he would get very quickly to China. Well, it was a very long journey indeed, 3.5 months, masses of scurvy, death on board, but he gets to islands, now called the Philippines, after King Philip of Spain. And there, stupidly, he gets involved in a local war, and he fights for the wrong side and gets killed. So that's the end of Magellan. So he never completes a circumnavigation. And his ship is, the command is taken over by Elcano, and he is second in command, takes command, gets back just with one tiny little carrack, 18 men surviving, but showing it could be done. Now, out of that comes this map. There's several of them. This is an atlas from the Admiralty Library. My photographs of showing what it's like, that it shows, I've arrowed there, they don't know what the coast of the North American continent or China, north of where the Portuguese were trading at stage. They don't know that, but they know this is Magellan's track in blue, so it's a stop press. And on the far left of the picture there, you'll see the islands called the Philippines. So there's Magellan's track on the latest. You see the Red Sea colored red and the Nile in Africa and so on, but you see it's still Ptolemaic with the India misshown and the UK, the Scotland actually leaning over. But this is drawn on a Ptolemaic grid in obeisance to that much honored man, Ptolemy. But on the next page of this very atlas in the Admiralty Library is this map. It's a portolan of the world and is utterly recognizable. And it's got the name of the ports that were visited, Red Sea and Red again. And it's got the scales of what we would call the latitude. You see the numbers in the center of the Atlantic moving up. So this is the known world at the time. Now, I challenged the geographers at Portsmouth University, Dr. Dominic Fontana, to put the modern world on top of it. And in red, there it is. And this is the most stunning map I'm going to show you today, because it shows the accuracy that they were able to navigate that some 500 years ago. You've got, let me just point out, that is near exact Africa and the eastern coast of South America, because they can tell latitude. The longitude, because you have to measure time, is always difficult. And you can see that it slips out the farther you go away from the European waters. So if you look across to the Red Sea, you see in red into Africa and then the shaded Red Sea. But nonetheless, and you've got India the same shape as it should be, and pretty accurately too. This map, in the same atlas as a Ptolemaic projection, just shows they weren't fools and the mariners knew far better than the cartographers were letting on about where they were. And another one, this is a really famous cartographer, Mercator, so important for a whole host of reasons, more interested in the mathematics of how to map the world than actually producing atlases. And but he produced this globe, 1541. And I put there, for those who would like to look at it, Royal Marines Greenwich here in the UK, they've done, during the lockdown, they've done a virtual one where you can expand it, rotate it, look at it, expand, and it's wonderful. But let me just show what I'm talking about. So let's look in, it's hard to make out there, but I've homed in there on Europe in the center, but there's the British Isles, and there is Scandinavia and up to the North Cape, and then Greenland there in green. And Mercator came with all sorts of ideas of that what the North Pole would look like. No one had ever got up there, but he made it up in some of his atlases. But what he was saying is the way to Cathay is very easy and short. And so it was. Well, it wasn't, but people were to try it. Sebastian Cabot, who was the son of Giovanni Cabot, and who had not gone on the second voyage and therefore survived. He'd gone as pilot major to Spain and then had been paid to come back to England to help us with a new venture. And he produced this map. And again, perhaps hard to see something in his map, I've ringed the United Kingdom, I've ringed the Scandinavia Peninsula. And he was saying you can go over the top and easily, instead of having to go around the Cape of Good Hope or through the Straits of Magellan, you can get to Cathay over the top or just round the top of the Tartary, as they called Russia in those days. Is going to be easy. So they decided that England would, much safer because they wouldn't be going into Portuguese or Spanish waters, and much quicker, they would do it. So they formed the first chartered joint stock company, 1551, called the Mystery Company and Fellowship of Merchant Adventurers, for the discovery of regions, dominions, islands, and places unknown. For the Company of Merchant Adventurers, they sold £25 shares to raise £6,000, Cabot being made the governor with 12 councillors to plan the voyage, and the shareholders were not allowed to take any part in decision-making in what went on. And they were largely people from, in fact, it was coming up Edward VI, the young Edward, and his court, and the city of London, the rich people of that, who put the money in. And it was to discover the discovery of Cathay and diverse other regions, dominions, islands, and places unknown. Fine ways. They appointed a well-born gentleman called Sir Hugh Willoughby, who won his spurs literally and was knighted for fighting for Henry VIII against the Scots. He was given a flagship, but the most important man of the story is Richard Chancellor, the pilot major of the Voyage, but really a young, capable mathematician and navigator who had been on some of these voyages and knew what he was doing. So they were given 3 ships, still tiny ships, and they were sent off. They sailed out May 1553 past the Palace of Greenwich. By that stage, King Edward was ailing. They didn't know what his illness was at that time, but he was sickening. But they sailed past with guns firing to send them off on this great voyage. They were to rendezvous if they got split up. Fortress Wardhouse, which was known right up at the North Cape, but they were split quite soon in a storm, and the other 2 ships were never to be seen. And Chancellor got through to what we will call the White Sea now by following the Cape around and anchored off a monastery, which turns out to be at Archangel. And he got there in that summer. But he got iced in when the winter came. The locals wouldn't let him go off, but he negotiated. They sent messages to Moscow, and eventually he was escorted by boat and sledge into Moscow, getting there in December, where he was allowed to call on Ivan the Terrible, which is what we called him. He was known in Russia as Ivan the Great, but he was keen to actually trade with England, because he was a bit fed up with the monopoly the Hanseatic League had with him for his trading. So he said, yes, we will help you go back and we will open up trade with you. So the next spring, he sets off again when the ship uniced, and he came through. He was robbed by the Flemish pirates on the way down the North Sea, but he gets back to find Queen Mary on the throne. So they found the Muscovy Company, 1555, giving it a monopoly for the trade, splitting any profit between the company and the crown, and Cabot being the governor for life in this case. Now, it operated, that company, until 1917. I know this, looked it up, because I found a fur coat of my mother's up in the roof, very moth-eaten, and inside was the Muscovy Company label. He burnt it, not because fur is frowned upon these days, but because it had so much moth. But from this first company operating this way with shares, there was a succession of them. There was the Turkey Company, Levant Company, both in the Mediterranean, the Barbary Company, and then 1600 under Queen Elizabeth, the East India Company, which went on basically to form the basis of the British Empire much later on. So the Muscovy Company was tremendously important. But the Portuguese were forming an empire. They got up to Japan and landed there 1544. In a letter home at the time, they said, you should not think that they're barbarians, for apart from our religion, we are greatly inferior. And indeed they were. There were such sophisticated people, the Japanese at the time, but they started a trade there. They set up in Nagasaki, ceded to a part of it into the Portuguese, where they set up a trading post. And indeed, there's a replica of it now. And if visiting there, you will see it. And they had a very profitable trade. They came back with spices, they came back with silks, and they would trade internally between China and Japan, and they did very well indeed, becoming the richest nation. Now Mercator comes back into the story because he produces a map of the world. And there's Japan. I've just been talking about this is 1569 now that he's come up with the atlas. But he comes up with this great big landmass to the south in the southern oceans, Terra Australis. In other atlases, it says Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern lands. And this supposition of the Greeks, shown by Ptolemy that there's a great continent there, is all important still, even at this time. They acknowledge that Magellan went forward through a strait, so Terra de Fuego, where Magellan actually saw fires on the rocks of the shore to the south as he went through the strait. So they acknowledge that, but assume that is tied up to the great big land. And he also shows that North America in this is separated from China. And so there's the thought that perhaps you can get around the top of North America in order to get back to Europe, which comes into the story. Not everyone agreed. So here's a Venetian map of the time showing that very much North America is connected. So these details, mariners have to go and find out what it is. The details have yet to be found. And the person who may have tried it first was Sir Francis Drake, who started his life joining ships to go down off the coast of Africa, in fact, to raid the Portuguese, capturing the slaves and some of the other goods and capturing them to bring them back and then taking them across, in fact, to the Caribbean to sell the slaves they like. But he decides to go on a round the world voyage where he set off to actually capture the treasure ships in the Pacific. And he, at one stage, thought he could come back again, but it became a round the world voyage. The Pelican was later called the Golden Hind when he got to the Pacific. And his circumnavigation, the first commander to circumnavigate, is tremendously important. He gets down very ably into the Magellan Straits. He sails through in much faster time than had Magellan. And when he gets out, he is hit by a storm, and his fleet, and he's lost one already, is hurled backwards and forwards, up and down, right down south. For 2 months, he's fighting his way in tempestuous seas, amazing navigation, seamanship to survive them. But he writes in his log, the outermost cape or headland of all these islands stands at near 56 degrees, without which there is no main island to be seen to the southward, but that the Atlantic Ocean and the Southern Ocean meet in a most large and free scope. So he's pouring a bit of scorn or doubt on the fact that there's a great big continent down to the south. And he's right, because he had managed to measure the latitude 56 degrees south. So in this storm, at some stage, he must have had a glimpse of the sun to get its altitude to work that out. And no wonder that the strait there is called the Drake Strait, sometimes Drake's Passage. He gets up the west coast of South America, finds the treasure ship, takes all the riches, takes 2 days to load it across, realizes he can't go back because he'll be attacked by the Spanish, and he goes on up the coast of West America, up and up. Probably he's trying to find that passage as shown in Mercator's atlas that could take him around the top. But he finds the conditions don't allow him. He writes, in this place was no abiding for us to go further north, for extremity of the cold, which now had utterly disadvantaged our men, would not permit us. The winds were directly bent against us, commanded us to the southward. Well, we think he got to 44 degrees or so north before turning around. That would be off Oregon in 2 days. But he made his way south. He went ashore and claimed, as he was told to do, any land with heathens there, claim it for the Queen, and he declared it Nova Albion. And here's a contemporary engraving of it, him with the natives. And one on the far right is crying away that he's arrived with all his troops. So a map of the time on the left there, is it Whale Cove, Oregon? Is that the map of it? Or is it the one off San Francisco, which is now called Drake's Bay? But whatever, he says, in the height of 38 degrees north, it pleased God to send us into a fair and good bay with a good wind to enter the same. So perhaps that's the one off San Francisco, just to the north of the bay. But here's a globe showing Nova Albion And again, the sea stretching unknown, but stretching further to the north as Mercator had shown it. So he decided he had to go across the Pacific. He knew Magellan had done that and got across there, so he did, and he gets to the Spice Islands, and he does it quite ably, in fact, and there he gets to Ternate, an important spice island, and he meets, and the print there on the right shows that he meets the rulers, and he begs to do a trade. You see the boat named Draco, Drake, and the ruler says yes. He wanted to break the Portuguese monopoly that was going on, so he'd get better prices. Drake, the only ship left was the Golden Hind, filled it with treasures, actually ditched his cannons, threw them over the side so he could get more stores on King. He came back just with one ship, 59 crew, but with riches that made him and the Queen rich for certainly his life, and paying off the national debt as well. An amazing circumnavigation with an amazing navigator and sailor. But of course, he went on to actually engage in the Armada, second in command of the Armada, the battle against the Spanish, and he went on doing other things that really upset the Spanish. The Dutch were getting stuck in and really interested in the Spice Islands. So this map comes out all about the spices, and they're listed there. Nancius is actually a clergyman who is getting all the intelligence about maps and drawing it. And they decide to send a fleet and send it off and get in, avoiding the Malacca and the fortified straits, what we would call now the Straits of Malacca, and he slips into Java, where he sets up and starts the trading. Now that was going through Portuguese waters, so the Dutch decided they would try a different route by seeing if they could go through Drake's Passage. And indeed, they worked their way around Terra del Fuego, meeting a storm again, but worked their way to the west and into the Pacific that way. But as they went round the southern land there, the Dutch maps show it as Cape Horn, because he, Putin, had come from the village of Horn, who were very proud to have their name given to what was thought to be the farthest south point of the known land. So the mariners were yet to find out, is there terra australis incognita, as these important maps have shown, and these were treasured maps by well-respected cartographers, or was there something else to be found? And indeed, was there a passage around the top of North America? Well, it took centuries for that to be found. And I'm going to stop my talk there, because the future ambitions for the Europeans for search for the answers to those two. And it took mariners another couple of centuries plus to actually find some of the answers. I'll summarize. I've shown you an awful lot of charts at great speed, but at least you have the joy of being able to pause and have a look and wind back in this. Whereas on board, and I do go fast, but I move along and cover a lot of ground, but actually then when I'm on board, a very interesting long discussions and questions about it, where I can point out the maps and show other ones to describe what I'm doing. But I've given you a few links to the websites where you can do it, the names of the maps where you can look online and find out far more about those maps. There's so much to it. I could have picked another equal number of maps to show the same sort of stories in a different way. But that's my way of showing these extraordinarily brave people who had the vision to go farther, the ambition driven both by the chance of getting money, although the majority probably died, but also finding out that first the quench for knowledge and to find new lands not yet found. And I'm next, what are we? We're next April, May, going to be spending some 5 weeks leaving Hong Kong, finishing in Vancouver, traveling, and the exploration of the from Japan further north up to the Bering Straits and then Alaska and down, the Russian and other navigators searching for it, and then Captain Cook, whose last voyage took him up into those waters and are trying to get through there. These are stories to be told of future generations from my stories today. So this is the 15th, 16th century, amazing mariners, and it takes me a lot of pleasure looking at these maps. I collect them. I hope I've interested you in them. But I say farewell now. And for those I've traveled with before, I hope to see you again. Thank you for staying in touch, as many of you have done. And have a happy time if you're voyaging with Viking in the future. May all go well with you. The sooner we get to see, and I can see your faces when talked to, rather than talking to a blank screen, I'll be very happy. So I'm ending my talk there. Farewell.